Hi, Adam. Who
Hello.
knows? Maybe it'll just be you and me.
Maybe.
All right. Did you have any specific questions?
Um,
Oh,
I
there's
don't,
Gabby.
I don't think so, but I can take a look. I think I did, but I
Okay.
can't remember them at the moment.
And looking at what we did last time, and I don't know if that was like the most helpful thing, we sort of went through the study guide and kind of talked about individual items on the study guide. Oh, there's Kyle. So we do have a few people here this morning. All right, I'll wait just another minute in case people are having challenges logging in. Gabby, I was just asking Adam if this was something that we wanted to do sort of like we had done last time, if that was sort of helpful for people, or if there's any other specific sort of format that people wanted to do.
I like to go through the study guide.
Okay, good. All right. What I will do is, especially if anybody wants, they can sort of go back and rewatch this from the beginning. Let me start sharing my screen here. Actually, I'm just going to make sure I've got so many things that are open on my computer right now. I'm going to just get rid of a number of things that are not necessary and turn off notifications. Let's see, for an hour. Good morning, Kyle.
Good morning.
I don't think I need to have Word open. I think I just need to have, yeah, that'll work. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. And then what I have open are homework files and annotated notes, and we can just sort of go through things. So let's see. Just going to make sure to go to Blackboard in case there's anything we wanted to grab there. All right, so going over here. So third exam is on three learning units. It's on carbohydrates, lipids, and membrane transport. And I'd say if I had to give sort of a percentage breakdown, it's probably 50%, 30%, 20%. In terms of sort of the emphasis on the exam, that it's certainly more carbohydrate focused because we obviously spent more time on that. Going over to Blackboard here for a second, we had 3 lectures on carbohydrates, 3 on lipids, and then only 2 on membrane transport. So kind of an easy breakdown that way. So structure drawing, you're going to need to know, and I'm looking kind of at the exam here. Larry wants to say, I swear, Larry, and have Larry say hi, and then we'll put him down. Here's Larry. So look at poor Larry. Larry is struggling right now. Larry has a flare-up of a respiratory infection that like makes it so he can't see. So then he doesn't want to go in the litter box and go to the bathroom. So he's peeing all over our house again, which is just loads of fun. So you do need to know how to draw a Haworth projection of one of the sugars that we've learned. So glucose is probably the easiest one to learn. If you can be here, but you have to lay down. Easiest one to learn, and then remember that mannose is a C2 epimer, galactose is a C4 epimer, and then fructose is the only ketose sugar that is here, so that's going to form a 5-membered ring. So go back and look at, actually I can do that here. Actually I will have to open these up here. Where did I put these? I think I put them here. I meant to open up these annotated notes as well, so I can just flip to them. So thinking about carbohydrate structure, even though we sort of spent a good bit of time here thinking about our linear forms, They only exist in that way like 10% of the time. So cyclized forms, and we had a mechanism to talk about how we cyclize form. It's hemiacetal or hemiketal formation. We sort of talked about the chemistry for how that happens. My plan later this afternoon is to go through and make some videos for units 5, 6, and 7 on things that I haven't put up yet. So in particular, as you're studying, or even after we're done here, or take a note, if there's a slide in particular that you see that you're like, yeah, I really would benefit from having an extra walkthrough of the creation of that slide. Usually these videos aren't more than like, 7, 8 minutes long. Let me know and I'll make sure to put that one in my list of ones to do. So here we can see we've got fructose and then glucose. So one of the things you'll have to make sure to note is the Greek letter that you have, because that determines the position of that OH group. Okay, this is beta D-glucose, but if it was alpha D-glucose, you'd have to draw that OH group down there. So that's some of that information you want to know for drawing a carbohydrate. And then drawing a fatty acid. You are going to have to draw some type of either fatty acid that's part of a phospholipid or a triglyceride, depending on what the prompt says, giving certain characteristics to those hydrophobic tails. So let me sort of go, might be easiest to kind of go to the homework here. And this is kind of an example of what you might see. Draw structure of a triglyceride that contains a saturated omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid. So knowing that these double bonds need to be cis, they're going to be 6 or 3 carbons from the end, no double bonds in a saturated fatty acid. I didn't tell you length here, but it might say C16 or C18, making sure that you've got the right connections here. We've got our glycerol backbone, which is going to have that oxygen then connected to what was the carboxylic acid of our fatty acid group. So that makes our ester linkage. Make sure that the ester linkage faces the right way, that the oxygen is towards that glycerol backbone. Now, if you had to draw a phospholipid, you would only have 2 fatty acids on it, and then it would just be a phosphate group here. Does that make sense to everybody? Questions on that? Not a lot of structure for this exam, but those are the 2 structures that I guarantee you're going to see a question on that. So you want to make sure you know how to draw those questions. All right. Structural concepts. So thinking about features of sugars. So let me come back to homework here again. Usually your homework is a good way to sort of summarize a lot of this stuff. So if we look at, here's a kind of definition of all of these different terms that we have: epimers, anomers, enantiomers, and diastereomers. So let me flip back to the study guide here just to highlight structural features of sugars. Know that they all end in -ose. They all have the same empirical formula, CH2O. Their nutritional value is 4 calories per gram. Functional groups that we have there is we have they're polyalcohols, and they always have 1 carbonyl containing functional group that's either an aldehyde or a ketone. Oh my gosh. I might have to have somebody come get you, Mr. Lair. Flipping back here for a second, just to highlight, right, we can see the different kinds of sugars, whether they're aldose or ketose, to be able to identify that piece. There's something I was just looking at here before Larry distracted me. Stereochemistry, right? Know that all naturally occurring sugars are D. At least in terms of how we encounter them. And then others, amino acids are L. We dealt with that last learning unit. Ketose and aldose sugars. Furanose and pyranose have to do with whether it's a 5 or a 6-membered ring. And then the difference between epimers and anomers. So let me just kind of come back here. When we're talking about epimers, these are sugars that differ at the stereochemistry of one of the non-carbohydrate containing, carboxylic acid carbonate. You are just really distracting right now, Larry. Carbonyl containing functional groups. And so this is the anomeric carbon. So any sugars that differ at just one of these other carbons would be epimers of each other. And note that the stereochemistry at this bottom carbon is the same for all of them, and that's where we get that D. Okay, so that's where we get that D. We have that there. So there was a lot of words and everything that were there. Does anybody have any questions on that part? Oh my God. He's like, do you guys have cats? Anybody have cats?
Mm.
You know, they do biscuits. Larry's nails need to be cut right now, and he's doing biscuits on my leg, and it is painful because his nails are really long. All right, differences between configurational and conformational isomers. And then let's see. So we've got, I think, a homework question sort of dealing with that, this idea of conformers and configurational isomers. So conformational isomers are the ones that we rotate by or interconvert by bond rotation. So that's really the chair flipping that we have by rotating bonds. Configurational isomers require that we break a bond. And so if we were to look back at this, for example, we had slides on this. Alpha and beta anomers are examples of configurational isomers because the only way to interconvert them are to break a bond. Okay. It's going to be rare that we actually have things that are named differently that are not configurational isomers, because conformational isomers, it's really just the chair flip that we have here. So these are both beta D glucose. So if they have the same name, they cannot be conformational isomers. Let's see. Questions on anything with that? Like fructose and glucose are actual isomers because they have completely different connections of atoms, right? It's a ketone versus an aldehyde. But galactose and glucose are epimers because they just differ at the stereochemistry, the position of an OH group at one carbon, specifically the C4 carbon. Then we talked about kind of making glycosidic bonds. So knowing the difference between an anomeric bond that cyclizes sugars, glycosidic bond is how we connect sugars together. We make that linkage, and there's lots of different nucleophiles that we can have there. So sort of a great summary for that is we talked about the mechanism for that, but then we talked about the different kinds of nucleophiles that we could have there. And so the obvious one that's related to much of this learning unit is the OH group of other sugars, and that's how we polymerize sugars together. You make polysaccharides, but we can have oxygen that comes as part of other functional groups. We can have oxygen as part, I should say specifically functional groups, but OH groups that are part of other kinds of molecules, like the OH groups that are in amino acids are going to allow us to decorate proteins with sugars. And then we can have N-glycosylation, which just basically means that the nucleophile is going to be a nitrogen atom. And this is how we are going to add sugar to hemoglobin. That's how we decorate your proteins on your blood or on your blood cells with carbohydrates that make you either be A, B, or O in terms of your blood type, or AB. And then we didn't specifically talk about it on this slide, but also adding the nitrogenous base to ribose. That's a glycosidic bond. That was actually one of your mechanisms from your first exam there. So that's what we think about in terms of different nucleophiles kind of coming together. Structural features of glycosidic bonds, being able to describe, and we have a slide here that kind of talks about all the different linkages. So from this slide, I would expect you to know for these specific sugars who the monomers are, okay? And then what the glycosidic bond is that's present. Remembering that if we see a beta in any of these glycosidic bonds, okay, that generally makes it be fiber, okay? Sucrose is kind of the one exception because it's an alpha beta linkage. That's also fuel. We can break that apart. So that is kind of structural features of those glycosidic bonds. Again, monomers and linkages for these guys that are listed here, understanding whether they are a reducing or a non-reducing sugar. So that has to do with whether or not that anomeric carbon is free. So coming back to notes here and looking at some structures, right? This was kind of a busy slide here, but we can see here with sucrose, anytime you have both of the anomeric carbons connected in a glycosidic bond, that's a head-to-head linkage, that is a non-reducing sugar. Most of the things that are obviously polymers, where we have more than two things connected together, somebody's going to have a free head group, a free anomeric carbon, and that is a non-reducing, that's a reducing sugar, because we could have the ability to kind of open this up and do chemistry. So we likened it in an analogy way to double knotting your shoes, your shoelaces, where a single knot is where you connect and make a ring, but you're one kind of, disconnection away from having a free carbonyl, which makes it a reducing sugar. So if you cyclize and then form a glycosidic bond, that's a double knot, and that makes that anomeric carbon non-reducing. So let's see, kind of gets us through that. Any questions so far? I've just been sort of reviewing and going through. Any questions on anything? Just to highlight, you, like last exam, you will have that 10 minutes at the end. So all of our exams sort of moving forward here, you still have that 10-minute time period where you can access notes. Some numbers that I want you to know. I want you to know some numbers that are related to sort of healthy glucose homeostasis, which are having a fasting blood sugar less than 90. They usually say less than 100 is what like the blood work will say, but truly a healthy fasting glucose is going to be less than 90. Hemoglobin A1C less than 5% is going to be sort of goal numbers for glucose homeostasis. Moving then into structural concepts, when we think about lipids here. Generally, lipids are just a catch-all for anything that is not water soluble. We talked a lot about fatty acids. The functional groups that we see in fatty acids, they've got a carboxylic acid functional group, but then we also have that hydrophobic, essentially an alkane or an alkene-based tail. Oops, I'm looking at ketone bodies there. Sorry, I jumped down. Nutritional value, 9 calories per gram. I do want you to remember that. Melting point, the differences between fats and oils. Let me go up to those notes here. When we talk about the differences between fats and oils, that has to do with things that we learned in our first learning unit, intermolecular forces. The greater the intermolecular forces, because of the shape, the greater the melting point, that's going to be solid at room temperature. So we call those fats versus oils. So things that are oils have lower melting points, and that's because they have lower intermolecular forces. Omega-3 versus omega-3 fats. So we sort of talked about early on sort of the structural features, what we see in terms of where there's double bonds, but general functions. I want you to remember that omega-3 fats are anti-inflammatory and omega-6 fats are pro-inflammatory. And it's not that omega-6 fats are bad because they're pro-inflammatory. We actually need them, but we just don't want to have excessively high levels of them. We talked about ketone bodies. Ketone bodies, right, are hydrophilic circulating fuels that are derived from fats. So when we break fats down into acetyl-CoA, and I don't think we specifically have it on this slide, but acetyl-CoA can get connected back together. Acetyl-CoA has 2 carbon atoms. So when we hook those together, we get back to 4 carbon pieces. And I start with acetoacetate because this is the first guy that you'd get when you put 2 acetyl-CoA groups together. So these guys are related by redox chemistry. So acetoacetate is the oxidized form of beta-hydroxybutyrate. And then we can take and decarboxylate acetoacetate and make acetone. So these guys are related in that we decarboxylate. This is a beta keto acid. That's going to be an important sort of structure that we'll recognize in a lot of different molecules that are undergoing fuel metabolism. All right, so that was a lot there. I'll pause for a second. Questions? Okay, ketone, describe the route for lipoproteins. I'm going to go back to homework here for a second. Looking at routes for lipoproteins, the idea is, I think I've got a homework slide here that kind of highlights, here's the different particles that I want you to know. Okay. We did talk very generally about the LDL particles that are what we call type A. So those are like the big fluffy kind of particles. Let me go to our notes and get to that slide so we can see where that is. So that was this slide. So the A type are sort of the large fluffy. The B type are these small dense ones. So if I come back over here, we've got SD, that stands for small dense. So I generally want you to know the key proteins that are present on the surfaces of those. There's 3 key proteins that we talked about. Two of them are involved in directing traffic, if you will. ApoB100 is found on stuff that's going from your liver out to the tissue. So that's our outbound cholesterol, if you will. And then the ApoA1 are inbound cholesterol. So that's taking a route back to your liver. And that's sort of important because if we are overloaded with cholesterol and we have too much stuff going out, that could be problematic. And then for the small, dense particles, those are the ones that have that LP little a. And it's really LP with like a subscript A, which is why we call it LP little a, but that's a little protein that's very pro-inflammatory. Okay, so those are, and I want you to know sort of those directions that we have. And I think that was on, yes, this slide here where we can see the different particles highlighting that ApoB100, the ApoA1, and then we've got this LP little a, that's a protein tag that's on our small, dense LDL particles. Questions on that? So that's that route piece. Statins, we talked about how statins interfere with cholesterol biosynthesis. Okay, so this is this idea that, and here it's on this slide where we talk about ketone bodies are made from acetyl-CoA. So the idea is anytime you have excess fuel, your body's going to make it into acetyl-CoA. There's lots of things that you can do with it. If it's truly excess, you're going to assimilate it into fatty acids and then triglycerides for storage. But if you actually have ketone bodies that need to be produced, they're produced from acetyl-CoA. But acetyl-CoA is also used to make this precursor called HMG-CoA. I do want you to know that name, HMG-CoA. And then statins interfere with the conversion of HMG-CoA to some cholesterol precursors. So that's how statins work. We talked about the challenge with that is when you interfere with something very far upstream in a metabolic or biochemical process, everything downstream is affected. So that you have the potential for statins to affect a lot of other things. And it's not uncommon for people who are on statins for their doctor to also prescribe that they take CoQ10 as a supplement because they know that their electron transport is going to be slightly compromised by interfering with the sort of this natural biosynthetic pathway. All right, so that's statins. Sort of the last thing that we had that we talked about with our lipid unit here was then moving into talking about a fat-soluble vitamin or a couple of fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin D, vitamin K, and then their impact on calcium homeostasis. So important things to remember. Vitamin D is necessary to get calcium out of your GI tract and also into your bones. But the important piece is K2 is also important for getting it from your blood into your bones. So it doesn't matter if you just have vitamin D3, that'll get it out of your gut and into your bloodstream. But if you are deficient in K2, that is going to mean that you're going to have excess calcium floating around in your bloodstream. And that hypercalcemia is what it is. And I actually didn't even write it right here. It's hypercalcemia. It's not hypersemia. Hypercalcemia is going to lead to soft tissue. What are you doing? Oh my God, just wait a minute. Hypercalcemia is that calcium is going to deposit somewhere, and it tends to deposit in soft tissues, whether they're joints, whether it's kind of plaques that you have. So tartar is an example of, if you have excessive levels of tartar, we talked about this, it's likely that you have a calcium dysregulation in your body. Let's see, I think that wraps up everything on this section, structural concepts with our unit 6. And then we've got a few things to talk about here with our protein or with our membrane transport, but I'll pause for a second to see if you guys have any questions and then deal with my child who needs to have his code put in so that he has more time on his cell phone. Yeah, I don't need to tell everybody. Yeah, I think I do. Should just approve for 15 minutes, but then you'll be back in 15 minutes. No, I approved all day. You can go away. All right. So moving on to membrane transport. So a couple of things here thinking about, this is structural concepts under membrane transport. Understand by name and with examples the different transport mechanisms. So symport, uniport, antiport. Okay, those deal with the direction of things. So a uniport only moves one thing. A symport and an antiport move two things, and whether it's the same direction or opposite direction. So that's the difference between those. And I think if I go to unit 7, There is a summary slide. Maybe I don't actually have one there for, I guess I don't have that specifically. Let me go to our notes here. Right, we early on sort of talked about, I can see it in my brain. I guess I don't have it here. It was a slide. Maybe it's because we sort of talked about it specifically, but hopefully those names make sense, import, uniport, and antiport, depending on the direction that things are moving. We talked about them in an example here with this, right? So we've got, this is a uniport because it's moving one thing. These are both moving two things: symport, same direction; antiport, opposite direction. Okay, so know those names. And then non-mediated facilitated diffusion, primary active and secondary active transport. So again, we had lots of examples of that, but if I come back to our notes here, this was this slide where we sort of went through and talked about, and here highlighted in red are those four names. Non-mediated transport basically just does not require any transport. Everything else falls under the mediated transport category. And whether you're moving things downhill and it's passive mediated, or uphill and it's active transport, then active transport is also subdivided into those two categories. Where the money is coming from, primary active transport is ATP. Secondary active transport is another membrane's gradient. And then primary active transport moves positively charged species. Secondary active transport moves neutral species. Okay, so that just some terminology and details there. We went through then examples of where we saw these. So one example we went through was that diet pill 2,4-dinitrophenol. Be able to know the structure of it, explain why it's able to pKa shift. And then we talked about what its function was. So that was sort of this slide. Its function is to translocate protons. And why that's important is we have the ability then to uncouple this process of fuel metabolism and ATP production. So normally fuel is metabolized, all those electrons go to the electron transport chain. The purpose of the electron transport chain is to make a proton gradient, which is then a gradient used to synthesize ATP. But if we dissipate this proton gradient, we then uncouple this process. That energy has to be released somehow, so it's released as heat. So two examples where we see an uncoupling of fuel metabolism and ATP production is with this diet pill, and that does it in an unnatural way, but produces heat. And then in a natural way, we have these uncoupling proteins that do the same thing, and they generate heat, but that's important because that's used for hibernating animals. We talked about it being used for infants and so forth. All right. So we just talked about uncoupling proteins. Terminology wise, know that isozymes is a term we're going to see a lot. Sometimes we talk about this as isoforms of enzymes. So these are enzymes that are differentially located and or regulated. So they perform the same function. So GLUT transporters move glucose in a passive mediated fashion. But GLUT2 and GLUT4 are located differently and they're regulated sort of differently. And we talk about that with their Km values. So let me sort of go over to our notes here for that and highlight on that slide. Okay, so we've got GLUT2 found in the liver and the pancreas. It's insulin insensitive, so it's always present. It has a high Km value. That means we need to have a higher concentration to have it be doing half of its activity, kind of binding half of its molecules. So it's not going to be pulling in glucose unless we're really high in concentration. Okay, and even though GLUT4 sort of is the same kind of thing, it's not going to be present unless we have really high concentrations of glucose. That's because it's insulin sensitive. High glucose, high insulin, put GLUT4 on the surface of your muscle and your adipose tissues, but because they have a low Km value, they're going to continue to pull glucose in until they're not present. And again, that's important because once we fall below 5 millimolar glucose, then our insulin levels are going to fall. And once insulin levels fall, your cells are going to resorb those GLUT4 transporters and they won't be on the surface anymore. Okay. Let's see. And again, relative Km values, you don't need to know those absolute numbers, but just know who has a higher Km value. Explain the thermodynamic driving potential of concentration gradients. So that's kind of going back to this first slide here, which has these crazy equations that are like, well, wait a minute, you know those equations. This really is just a flavor of delta G equals minus RT ln of KEQ. And it's so reminding us that the magnitude of this force is proportional to the concentration difference of molecules inside or outside. That's what this equation is telling us. And then we can map onto that an extra added force if we are moving something that's charged. So all that this is it says that the magnitude of that thermodynamic driving force is going to be larger if we have something that is a charged species. So that's all that that means. We already actually talked about this uncoupling of fuel oxidation and ATP production and how it generates heat. 2,4-dinitrophenol, the diet pill, and then uncoupling proteins both do that. And then the last piece, and there's a couple of things I'm going to mention here. They are not on this study guide, but they are, maybe I put them later. I didn't talk about valinomycin, but that is something that I do want you to know about. So we'll talk about that in just a second here. So enthalpy compensation for the potassium channel. So I do want you to know about this dynamic of, hey, how do you get a basketball through, but not a baseball? Okay. Don't talk about sports when you're explaining things to me, but use that to explain the analogy of, hey, when we talk about a hydrated potassium cation, it is bigger than a hydrated potassium or a hydrated sodium ion. But even once we remove those waters of hydration, we need to think about why that small piece can't get through. And it has to do with the fact that taking those waters of hydration off is an enthalpic cost. That's not going to fully happen unless on the back end we have some type of a gain here. And so we need to have some type of a gain. And in this case, it's an enthalpic gain. Okay, it doesn't always have to be enthalpy. It could be entropy. But in this example, we have an intermolecular force that's made to pay for an intermolecular force that's broken. Okay. And because sodium is too small, okay, and imagine me, remember when I was walking through like the channels between our tables, it was like I had the little T-Rex arms. I was too short to be able to reach out and form new intermolecular forces. So I couldn't pay for the cost of taking the water off of me if I was sodium, but I was the right size if I was potassium. Okay. So oh, and then I did want to make sure just to mention this concept with valinomycin. I really didn't talk too much about porins. I don't even think I have a question on that, but valinomycin, I do want you to think about this because conceptually it's interesting to think about it, that it's like a reverse micelle. So it's this chemical structure that forms a ring that actually forms a cage that's greasy on the outside, hydrophilic on the inside, and it's got the perfect size. And then these oxygen atoms here are going to be able to form those ion dipole interactions to bind to a potassium ion. So it binds to potassium ions, and because it's greasy on the outside, it can diffuse easily through a lipid bilayer. So it will diffuse potassium gradients in bacteria. And when bacteria cannot build up those proton gradients, they can't do their biochemistry. So that's why it's lethal. Questions? All right. So moving into functions, and then there's a few application pieces. Okay, so function, this is sort of a big picture thing, thinking about how we manage glucose homeostasis. So the pancreatic hormone for low blood sugar or an adrenal hormone in response to stress, and then the effects on the liver and skeletal muscle and glucose. So I'm going to go to the slide that really is sort of talking about. And these are definitely slides that I'm going to be making some videos on. So it's talking about glycogen metabolism. So remember, glycogen is a glucose polymer store. It's essentially animal starch that's in your skeletal muscle and liver. And those two different places for storage differ in terms of how they're going to help if you need to tap into those reserves. If we're talking about it in the liver, it's going to be broken down for global use. If we're talking about it in your skeletal muscle, it's broken down for local use. And we sort of talked about the signals that would cause you to break down glycogen, okay? Your adrenal glands can secrete epinephrine. So epinephrine is a stress hormone, and it's like, hey, we might need to fight or run away, but regardless, you need to give some glucose to my muscles so that I can do that. And so this is a signal. It's a need state signal that ultimately is going to initiate a cascade. We will learn about this in Biochem 2, but it will initiate a cascade that allows us to break down glycogen into glucose so muscles have that energy to be able to fight or flee. Now, from the liver side, the liver will also respond to epinephrine, and it'll say, hey, sounds like you're in trouble. You're going to need to fight or flee. We're going to break down our reserves and we're going to put them out in the bloodstream so that any cell that needs them can use them. So the liver is going to respond to epinephrine as well. But the other hormone that I want you to know that's a need state hormone is glucagon. And I know these names start getting like confusingly similar. Glucagon is the hormone that's secreted by the pancreas in response to low blood sugar levels. It is the opposite of insulin. So glucagon and insulin are sort of opposite hormones, okay? Glucagon will be responded to in the liver by the liver breaking down its glycogen stores and saying, hey, blood sugar sounds like you're low. I'm going to help you out here, break down my glycogen into glucose, and I'm going to export it. Now, we talked about the fact that muscles, they do not break down and release their blood sugar to the bloodstream. They're only local use. So it's not surprising that they don't have a receptor for glucagon. They're not interested in helping from a global standpoint. So they're not even going to listen to the signal. So it's important to recognize that muscle cells do not have a receptor for glucagon because they don't respond to it. Make sense? We're going to revisit these concepts next semester, but so this is sort of a first introduction. So that's a slide that I am going to redo and talk about with glycogen. And then we talked about sort of the flip side of it. Like, let's talk about then the high blood sugar sort of situation. And this has to do with that opposite hormone, high blood sugar hormone, insulin sort of coming into play here. And so we talked about now the stimulus that you have here is high blood sugars. Now, down here at the bottom of this is sort of the glucagon half of it, which we talked about on the last slide. So we're only talking about sort of the top half here, which is the insulin response to high blood sugars. And we sort of went through this slide, and I'm not going to go through it in detail right now because I will make, like I said, a review slide on this. But to kind of go through quickly, blood sugar levels are going to rise. Your pancreas produces insulin, highlighting that if you are a type 1 diabetic, you cannot produce insulin. A type 2 diabetic means you still do produce insulin, but in this earmuffs region, you don't listen to it. But walking through the normal sort of situation first, high blood sugar, pancreas secretes insulin, that's going to be a signal for your body's cells to take up more glucose. That's going to be through that GLUT transporter, either GLUT4 on your muscle, GLUT2 in your liver. So we've got kind of these two spaces here. Muscle is going to be GLUT4, liver is going to be GLUT2. Both of those are going to help pull in blood sugar levels so that your blood sugar levels are going to decline and you get sort of back to that glucose homeostasis, right? About 90 milligrams per deciliter of blood. So then we kind of further went on and explained, well, once this blood sugar level declines because you pulled it into these cells, what sort of happens? Well, muscle cells are going to store it as glycogen. Liver cells are going to store it as glycogen, and they're going to replenish those short-term reserves. They only have about 12 hours worth of energy stored there, and they're not infinite in size. So once you kind of pack those back up, any extra blood sugar is going to be then produced into triglycerides. That happens in the liver, and it gets stored in the adipose tissue. And we've kind of highlighted this multiple times. When you have high levels of insulin, that promotes fat storage, and it actually inhibits fat breakdown. Because if you think about what insulin is supposed to be, it's like, hey, we've got plenty of blood sugar. We've just eaten. Don't break down your fats. We've got plenty of food here. That's what that signal is saying. But the normal state of events is your blood sugar is supposed to rise, your insulin rises, and then your blood sugar falls and your insulin falls. So what happens though, when you are a type 2 diabetic, you stop listening to that signal and your body keeps producing more and more insulin. And so you start having chronically high levels of insulin. Okay. And so once we start having this insulin resistance, which is what we see right here, okay, we talked about this having like earmuffs. We're no longer listening to this insulin signal. Okay. We are really going to be impacting the ability of our blood cells to be taking up sugar, even though we're still going to have those GLUT4 receptors that are there. But what's really going to be problematic is your liver we're just not going to be able to pull in that bloodstream or pull in that sugar from the bloodstream. So really now the only option here is to either make it into triglycerides. The other option is to pee it out. We talked about that's a classic symptom of somebody who is diabetic is they're going to have sugar in their urine. And that's important because your body knows that if you have chronically elevated levels of blood sugar, which is a hallmark of both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, that's toxic. And if you can't kind of get back down to this homeostatic level, it's going to be problematic. It causes tissue damage. It's very pro-inflammatory, lots of problems. So we talked then again about the solution. So this is another slide I will recreate with a video if you feel like Sunday night or something you want to watch back through it. Diet, exercise, medication, 3 ways that we can sort of help this. Obviously, physicians are very interested in this prescription way. So are pharmaceutical industries, because that's how they make money is by prescribing pills and doing so. Now, metformin is an important type 2 diabetes medication. It increases insulin sensitivity and it inhibits this process that we call gluconeogenesis. So it's not going to let you make more blood sugar. Now, diet and exercise can be incredibly powerful levers in this space. So again, by eliminating or reducing carbohydrates in your diet, it can really help your insulin sensitivity. Now, part of the problem can be if you've spent so much time in this earmuffs world where you're not listening and your pancreas is thus ramping up the amount of insulin that it's making, you eventually will become type 1 diabetic because you just kind of tap out your pancreas's ability to sort of do that work. Exercise is really important too, because exercise actually helps with your body's muscle cells taking up glucose. And actually, the more muscle you have, the bigger a sink you really have to tap into to take in blood sugar when you eat it. So that's why, athletes that have a lot of muscle, carb loading, no problem for them, because even though they put a massive amount of glucose into their bloodstream, they're going to store it in their muscles. They're storing it again as that glycogen, which is going to be, I should point over here, glycogen in their muscles. And that's going to be really great when they're doing, a competition the next day, because they're going to have lots of glucose readily available to be used right in those muscles. So these 2 slides, and I think it was just these, these 2. Those are intense slides. Those are definitely ones that I'm planning on sort of recreating to kind of go through because there's a lot that's there. So I'm going to pause there for a second, see if anybody has questions on sort of that first part. Good. Okay, I think we've sort of talked about some of this already. We did describe the normal insulin response and the insulin resistance. That was that second slide there. Insulin is really a detox hormone. So, if high blood sugar is toxic, insulin is there as a way to sort of detox your blood from having high levels of blood sugar. So again, the problem though is that if you continually put in high amounts of blood sugar, you're going to have to keep putting in more and more insulin, and then that just becomes a non-sustainable system. We've actually talked about this already, but it's more of that function piece of that diet pill or uncoupling proteins. They work by discharging that proton gradient. And again, that breaks that connection. Let me go back here. I can see it in my head, but to talk to you guys, it breaks that connection between fuel being translated into your body's biological currency. So it sort of breaks that connection, and it does so by discharging that proton gradient. Diet pill and uncoupling proteins both operate in the same way. The uncoupling protein, this actually is not, but if I was to imagine that this was an uncoupling protein, it just basically provides a channel for protons to go back through. Protons to go back through. But hallmark to both of them is they release that extra energy First law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It's just converted to other forms. And so that extra energy is released as heat. And that is beneficial if you are a hibernating animal, and unfortunately can be lethal if you take too many of these diet pills. And actually, we described a lot of these already. We described how the potassium channel works, why it's selective over sodium, and then we understand how those two glucose transporters operate. So even though we just talked about structural pieces, we tapped on and discussed the function when we sort of discussed those just a second ago. Questions? Okay, last two pieces, applications. Two main things from our learning unit here on membrane transporters is we talked about the sodium glucose transport system. Okay, so that's this guy. And so three transporters are actually part of this system. When they talk about SGLT, they're really just mainly talking about this guy in the middle here. Okay, the one that we highlighted is number 2. But it's important to highlight number 1 because number 2 can't work if number 1 doesn't do its job, because number 1 is responsible for building up that sodium gradient that this sodium glucose symport uses. And then the whole purpose of this is to pack the inside of our intestinal cells with the sugar that we're pulling in from our intestinal lumen, and then allow it to flow out down its concentration gradient into our bloodstream. So spent a good bit of time talking about this, not only in this situation, but we talked about it why, Diet Gatorade is sort of a fallacy if you want an electrolyte replacement, and also kind of seeing its connection with the treatment aspect of cholera disease. And so this last part was just saying, talk about these two transporters that we see in cholera disease. CFTR is again that, I think I have it. Oh, I didn't. I should have posted the notes. I'll have to check and see it. If I didn't post the notes that have the cholera toxin case study, I need to make sure and go do that. I'll actually see if I can find these here. I thought, did this guy? There it is. This is the one I actually need to label Unit 7 notes. Unit 7 notes, fall 22. But let me open this guy because this is the one that has the cholera. This is the one I'm pretty sure, well, maybe I posted the wrong one. I may have posted the wrong one now that I think about this because I had labeled that other one. At the end of the day, it comes down to this slide. I need to get there, right? I want you to fundamentally know what each transporter does. And obviously we just spent a lot of time talking about this one. CFTR is the CF stands for cystic fibrosis, but it's a chloride channel. So it moves chloride ions, and it's going to move chloride ions out into your GI tract. Okay. And that's because we have hyperactivated it with that cyclic AMP production. So this is kind of another sort of piece to understand how this process works. So we have our cholera toxin bind to a receptor. We activate adenylate cyclase. And the reason I'm saying this is important to know is we are going to revisit this later on. So this is something that it's not just unique to cholera, it's unique to something, a process that we're going to spend more time learning about. So this is something that I want you to know. We activate adenylate cyclase. We increase concentrations of cyclic AMP that activates pKa, which is a master phosphorylator. And one of the downstream effects is we open up this CFTR membrane transport channel, and that allows chloride to be put out into the GI tract. Water is going to go out with it as a way to try to balance those ion charges. And when you have excess levels of water that you put out into your GI tract, that causes diarrhea. So this is sort of the pathway that I want you to know and think about for what happens with cholera. And that gets us through our study guide here. Questions? Let me take a second. I'm just going to do a quick flip through on the notes and just make sure that there wasn't something that we covered in class that I don't have on your study guide that I want to make sure you know. So we talked about this. Flip up here. Talked about those. you do have a mechanism. Okay, so you want to make sure, and again, it's only, I have to check point values on these. I don't know how many points. I don't have any points it is, but it's not like a substantial amount. So if you still feel like mechanisms are your nemesis, don't stress about it, but let's keep doing what we can to sort of get you up to speed. We talked about these, talked about those guys. Don't worry about we really didn't talk about this. So if there happens to be a question on this on the test, because we didn't spend a lot of time on this slide, everybody will just get credit for it. I can't remember right now if there's a question on it. All right, let me just flip through homework really quick and see if there's anything else I wanted to highlight. Draw structures, we did confirmation configuration, we talked about these definitions. You need to know who's connected to who and the linkages, whether they're fuel versus fiber. Yeah, Gen Chem calculation. Like I would expect you to be able to sort of do these kinds of calculations, right? Show that 5 millimolar is related to 90 milligrams per deciliter, right? And then highlight, that is really not, that is 4.5 sugar cubes of sugar in your blood to be like a normal level. That is not a lot of sugar. I used to put way more than that. You guys know I have a sugar addiction. I used to sit there and tell you this story. Like my mom would not buy sugar cereals. This did not start like just with me. I grew up in a household that did not like have a lot of sugar, but I would say we'd have Cheerios and Rice Krispies. And I would sit there and I would like hide behind the box of cereals. And I would like take you can put a little brown sugar on. Brown sugar is good because I would literally take that spoon and I would like put a golf ball size of sugar on there. And I'd be like, I'd still be hiding behind the cereal box and I'd put it in and I'd bury it underneath. Oh, so good. It's so bad. All right. So that's carbohydrates. Let's look at lipids. Just going to flip through my notes real quick, make sure there's not anything that I want to make sure we talk about that we didn't. We didn't specifically talk about this, but know these distinctions for how we don't ever have double bonds in conjugation. They're always cis, never before carbon 9, and we always see an even number of carbon atoms for our naturally occurring amino acids. Trans fats are bad, right? We know trans fats are bad. Talked about all of that. Talked about cholesterol stuff, statins. Oh, I do want you to know COX. That wasn't part. So just know that COX is the enzyme that's responsible for producing molecules that cause pain, inflammation, and fever. So drugs that alleviate pain, inflammation, and fever generally interfere with this enzyme's activity. Most drugs, and we're going to learn about this as we get into kinetics in our next learning unit after we finish enzyme chemistry here, but most drugs operate by interfering with the activity of an enzyme, okay? And they don't let that enzyme do its function, make its metabolite, whatever it happens to be. So in this case, yeah, we have the ability to prevent the production of those molecules that cause pain, inflammation, and fever. Actually, I forgot, I did not get to this slide, but this was just kind of highlighting some high level things about what we need to think about with cholesterol. If we think about things that Hippocrates said, like disease starts in the gut, like, wow, he knew about the microbiome before physicians knew about the microbiome. Like there's just so much. And then the fact that cholesterol gets a bad rap, and it's, probably not the case. All right, looking at lipid homework really quick. We talked about drawing something. You do not need to know names. This last column, you definitely don't need to know. I do want you to be able to think about the reason that saturated fats have a long shelf life and high stability is because they don't have any reactive functional groups. Right? So the more double bonds you put in something, the more reactive something can be. And that's why you need to store things like olive oil in the fridge, or why nuts go rancid, because if they have those unsaturated fats, but do not need to know names, specific names. I would like you to know some of these, like where they come from. Like, where do you get your omega-3 stuff? You can get it from a bottle, but you can also get it from food sources. We talked about that, and that was it for those guys. Let's see here. Last thing, I think we went through, I'll have to make sure to repost, because let me actually check real quick, because that'll make sure. Membrane transport. Oh, I didn't even put them up yet. Let me do this right now before I forget. Item. Dr. Prenti's annotated notes. House files. 7. Go. All right. So sorry, I made those like 2 days ago and I didn't realize I didn't post them. So I think we went through, while this is finishing uploading, go through here. Went through that stuff, valentomycin, don't worry too much about porins, potassium channel, glucose transporters, SGLT, and then we've got our cholera case study. And then homework. Thermodynamic driving force, that equation, GLUT2 versus GLUT4, and then the SGLT. So that was the only stuff for homework for that. Okay, so this is now up. And there's annotated notes for Unit 7. Any other questions? Yeah, I've got them up for other ones. Okay. You should also be able to go back and take a look at quiz questions that you had from Unit 6, 5, 6, and 7. Here, if you want to kind of see things that you may or may not have missed, please do let me know if there's something that's on there. That Blackboard is not an easy place to create quizzes and exams, so it's possible that there could be something that's not right. So do let me know if something does not look right in that regard. Anything else? Well, thanks for joining me, guys. Thanks for making it so that it was not me just talking to myself, or even though Adam, it would have been fine just to talk to you. It is nice to have a group of people to talk to. You guys are unusually quiet. Is it still early? Yeah. All right. Well, you can send me questions via Teams if you have any other questions or concerns, but if not, I will see you Monday. Remember to come prepared that you can have that last 10 minutes of class to have access to your notes. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome.